The evening rush at Le Ciel had begun, and Emily Chen felt the familiar ache in her feet as she hurried between tables. 6 hours into her shift, with another 4 to go, she paused briefly at the water station to catch her breath. The restaurant's crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the dining room, illuminating the faces of New York's elite who came here to see and be seen. "Table 12 needs more bread," called out Rick, another server rushing past with a tray of martinis. Emily nodded, quickly arranging a basket of freshly baked sourdough. At 23, she wasn't much different from the other servers working double shifts in Manhattan's high-end restaurants. What set her apart was the small notebook tucked in her apron pocket, filled with calculations tracking every dollar of her tips against her tuition payments. 3 more semesters until she finished her business degree, if she could keep up with the payments. "Emily, you're taking the private dining room tonight," said Vivian, the floor manager appearing suddenly beside her. "Mr. Grant just called. He's bringing 7 guests. Very important client dinner." Emily felt her stomach tighten. The private dining room meant higher tips, but also more scrutiny. Everyone knew about Alexander Grant, the tech entrepreneur whose latest app had rocketed him onto the Forbes list. His reputation for being demanding preceded him. "Doesn't Thomas usually handle the private room?" Emily asked, thinking of the senior server who typically managed VIP guests. Thomas called in sick. "It's you or nobody," Vivian replied, straightening Emily's black tie. "Remember, these tech types can be unpredictable. Some are down to earth, others—" She trailed off, raising an eyebrow. Emily nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. She'd served difficult guests before. "I'll handle it." The private dining room stood apart from the main restaurant with its own entrance and a small antechamber where guests could mingle before being seated. Its most striking feature was the baby grand piano in the corner, a beautiful instrument that was more decoration than anything else. Occasionally, during holiday events, the restaurant hired musicians, but most nights it sat silent, its polished surface reflecting the room's elegant lighting. Emily quickly prepared the room, checking each place setting twice, making sure the temperature was perfect, and that the special reserve wines Mr. Grant had requested were properly decanted. Just as she finished, she heard voices approaching. Alexander Grant entered first. In person, he looked younger than in his magazine photos, perhaps 35. With dark hair showing hints of gray at the temples. He wore no tie with his expensive suit, giving him a casual confidence that contrasted with the formal setting. "This way, ladies and gentlemen," he said, ushering in his guests. 3 women and 4 men, all dressed in business attire that suggested serious money. Emily stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Good evening and welcome to Le Ciel. I'm Emily and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Grant barely glanced at her, his attention on his phone. One of the women, blonde with a sharp gaze that missed nothing, looked Emily up and down before taking her seat. The others filed in, their conversation already flowing about market shares and investment rounds. "We'll start with the Krug," Grant said, finally looking up at Emily. His eyes were startlingly blue, assessing her with the same intensity she'd seen him use on the room. "And whatever appetizers the chef recommends. My guests are hungry." "Of course, sir. The chef has prepared some special selections tonight. Would you like me to bring an assortment?" "Perfect," he replied, turning away as if she'd already left. In the kitchen, Emily relayed the order, adding, "They seem tense. Business dinner." The chef, Jean-Philippe, nodded knowingly. "Grant's group? I heard rumors his new project isn't going well. Investors getting nervous." He handed her a tray of delicate appetizers. "These should help. Food always smooths difficult conversations." When Emily returned, the atmosphere in the private room had indeed grown strained. Grant sat at the head of the table, his relaxed posture now rigid as one of the men, older, with steel-rimmed glasses, spoke in low, urgent tones. "Simply cannot justify another extension without seeing concrete results," the man was saying. 8 weeks, Harold. That's all I'm asking." Grant replied, his voice controlled but tight. "The engineering team has overcome the major hurdles." Emily moved silently around the table, placing appetizers and pouring champagne. Years of serving had taught her how to become nearly invisible while remaining attentive. She noticed how Grant's fingers tapped restlessly against the tablecloth, how the blonde woman kept glancing at her watch, how the atmosphere crackled with unspoken tension. Throughout the first course, Emily maintained her professional demeanor, anticipating needs before they were voiced. When one guest mentioned loving truffles, she made sure the chef included extra shavings on his plate. When another absently mentioned a shellfish allergy, she quietly adjusted her order. As the main course arrived, the conversation shifted from tense business talk to more casual subjects. Grant, noticing his water glass empty, looked around and caught Emily's eye as she appeared instantly at his side to refill it. "Thank you," he said, really looking at her for the first time. "You're very attentive." "Just doing my job, sir," she replied with a small smile. "You've worked here long?" he asked, surprising her with the personal question. "Almost 2 years now." Grant nodded, seeming to file away this information. "The service is impeccable. I appreciate attention to detail." The blonde woman, introduced earlier as Victoria, the company's CFO, cleared her throat. "Alex, about the timeline we were discussing." His attention immediately shifted back to business, but something had changed. Throughout the remainder of the meal, Emily noticed Grant watching her occasionally, his expression thoughtful. As dessert was being served, one of the younger men in the group, slightly drunk from the wine, gestured toward the piano. "Nice piano. Does anyone ever play it?" "Mostly for show," Emily answered, setting down a chocolate souffle. "During Christmas, the owner brings in musicians." "What a waste," the man said, turning to Grant. "Alex, you used to play, didn't you?" "Back in college?" Grant waved away the comment. "Badly, and a lifetime ago." Emily moved efficiently around the table, serving coffee and petit fours, aware that the dinner was drawing to a close. The conversation had returned to business, but the tone remained strained. Despite the excellent food and wine, it was clear that Grant hadn't achieved what he'd hoped from this meeting. As she cleared the dessert plates, Emily accidentally bumped into the blonde woman's chair. "Sorry," she murmured, steadying her tray. Victoria turned, irritation flashing across her face. "Do be careful," she said coldly. "It was my fault," Grant interrupted, surprising everyone. "I moved my chair back without looking." He turned to Emily with an unexpected smile that transformed his face. No harm done. The brief interaction seemed to shift something in the room. Grant leaned back in his chair, surveying his guests with renewed confidence. "I understand your concerns," he said, addressing the older man with the steel glasses. "But perhaps we're approaching this from the wrong angle. What if we—" He launched into a new proposal, his energy suddenly magnetic. Emily continued her duties, moving quietly through the room. She noticed how Grant had taken control of the conversation again, how his guests were now leaning forward, engaged. Whatever frustration had filled the room earlier was gradually being replaced by cautious optimism. As the evening wound down and the group prepared to leave, Grant approached Emily while his guests gathered their belongings. "Thank you for the excellent service tonight," he said, handing her his credit card. "You made a potentially difficult evening much smoother." "I'm glad I could help," she replied, processing his payment. He studied her for a moment. "You seem familiar somehow. Have we met before?" Emily shook her head. "I don't think so, sir." He said, seeming unconvinced. His gaze drifted to the piano, then back to her. Something curious flickered in his expression, but before he could say more, his associates called him away. As the group filed out, Emily began clearing the remaining glasses. Through the doorway, she could hear Grant's confident voice as he bid farewell to his guests. Tonight had been just another evening at Le Ciel, another group of wealthy patrons she would likely never see again. Yet something about Alexander Grant lingered in her mind, not his wealth or status, but the moment of genuine connection when he'd stepped in to deflect blame from her. Little did Emily know that their brief encounter was about to change everything. As she finished cleaning the private dining room, she glanced at the silent piano in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the dimmed lights. Outside, Alexander Grant paused before entering his waiting car, turning to look back at the restaurant with a thoughtful expression. A plan was forming in his mind, one that would bring him back to Le Ciel sooner than anyone expected. 3 days later, Emily was surprised to see Alexander Grant's name on the reservation list again. The private dining room had been booked for another business dinner, this time for 12 people. "Looks like you made an impression," Vivian said, checking the evening's bookings. "He specifically requested you as the server." Emily raised her eyebrows. "Really?" The dinner seemed tense. "I figured they'd go somewhere else next time." Well, whatever you did, keep doing it. His last bill had a 30% tip. Vivian handed her a printed menu. Chef's creating a special tasting menu tonight. Make sure everything's perfect. As Emily prepared the private dining room, she wondered what had prompted Grant to return so quickly. Business dinners like his typically happen monthly, not twice in 1 week. She arranged fresh flowers on the table and noticed the piano had been dusted and its top propped open. Someone had been in to tune it recently, though she couldn't remember seeing a piano technician. At exactly 7 o'clock, Alexander Grant arrived. This time he came alone, standing in the doorway of the empty dining room with his hands in his pockets. "Good evening, Mr. Grant," Emily greeted him. "Your other guests haven't arrived yet." "They'll be here soon," he replied, walking into the room. Tonight he wore a dark blue suit with a matching tie, looking more formally dressed than during his previous visit. "I wanted to arrive early to make sure everything was in order." Emily gestured to the table. "Chef has prepared a special menu for tonight. Would you like to review it?" "In a moment." Grant walked around the room slowly, his gaze lingering on the piano. "Do you play?" he asked suddenly. The question caught Emily off guard. "The piano?" She hesitated, memories flickering briefly across her face. "Not anymore." Grant looked at her with interest. "But you used to." Before she could answer, the door opened and a group of people entered, different from his previous guests. These were older, more conservative in their dress, with the polished appearance of serious investors. "Alex," called a gray-haired man, striding forward with an outstretched hand. "Starting without us?" The moment broken, Emily stepped back into her professional role as Grant greeted his guests. She noted the subtle shift in his demeanor, a straightening of his shoulders, a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Throughout the appetizer course, the conversation remained pleasant but formal. Emily noticed Grant was drinking sparkling water instead of wine, staying sharp while several of his guests indulged heavily in the expensive bottles she opened. "So," said a woman with short silver hair and piercing eyes, "we've reviewed the prospectus, Alexander. Impressive projections, but perhaps a bit optimistic." Grant leaned forward. "The numbers are solid, Claire. We've run every scenario." "That's what Keller said about his medical app before it crashed and burned," remarked another man, chuckling. "Cost me $2 million. The mood shifted subtly. Emily, serving the second course, sensed the tension building beneath the polite conversation. Grant maintained his composure, answering questions with confidence, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes. By the main course, the questions had become more pointed. The investors, initially cordial, were now pressing harder, their skepticism increasingly evident. "Your last venture had similar projections," said Claire, cutting her steak with precise movements. "Yet it underperformed in the second quarter." "Different market conditions," Grant countered. "And we still delivered a 12% return." "12% isn't 30, remarked the gray-haired man. "Which is what you're promising now." As Emily cleared plates and brought dessert, she could see Grant's frustration building. His answers remained professional, but his fingers drummed lightly on the table, a tell she'd noticed during his previous visit when he was stressed. One of the younger investors, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "The fact is, Alex, your reputation has taken some hits. The board needs more than promises." Grant sat back, his expression cooling. "I'm not offering promises. I'm offering a track record of successful innovation." "If that's not enough, what we need," interrupted Claire, "is confidence that you can still deliver something extraordinary. The Alexander Grant who revolutionized mobile payments 5 years ago." The desserts Emily had just served sat untouched as the conversation grew increasingly strained. She moved quietly around the table, refilling water glasses, feeling the weight of unspoken tension. Grant's gaze drifted to the piano, then back to his skeptical audience. A strange expression crossed his face, frustration mixed with sudden inspiration. "You want proof I can still recognize exceptional talent and opportunity?" he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs around the table. "That I know quality when I see it?" The room fell silent, all eyes on him. Emily paused near the service door, sensing something unpredictable about to happen. Grant stood up, napkin placed precisely beside his plate. "Success in business isn't just about spreadsheets. It's about instinct, recognizing hidden value others miss." He walked to the piano, running his hand along its glossy surface. "This beautiful instrument sits here unused night after night. Wasted potential. The investors exchanged confused glances. One checked his watch discreetly. I made my first million by betting on a programmer no one else would hire, Grant continued. Everyone thought I was crazy. Too risky, they said. He turned, his gaze sweeping the room and landing on Emily. Sometimes extraordinary talent is right in front of us, unrecognized. Emily felt a wave of unease. The conversation had taken a turn she couldn't predict, and somehow she sensed it involved her. What's your point, Alexander? Claire asked, her tone suggesting her patience was wearing thin. Grant smiled, the confidence returning to his posture. I'm proposing a demonstration. A small wager, if you will. The word wager caught the investors' attention. Several sat straighter in their chairs. I believe, Grant continued, his eyes still on Emily, that someone in this room has exceptional undiscovered talent. If I'm right, you'll reconsider your hesitation about my new venture. The gray-haired man leaned forward, interest piqued. And if you're wrong, then I'll withdraw my proposal and return your initial commitments, no questions asked. A buzz of conversation erupted around the table. Emily began gathering empty coffee cups, trying to make herself invisible, but Grant's voice cut through the noise. Emily, he called, stopping her in her tracks. Would you come here, please? Heart pounding, she set down her tray and approached him. The entire room watched with curious eyes. Yes, Mr. Grant? He gestured to the piano. I noticed something the other night. When you were clearing the table, the piano piece playing through the speakers, Chopin's Nocturne, your fingers were moving. Emily felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed the unconscious movement, muscle memory from years of practice responding to the familiar melody. You played once, didn't you? Grant asked, his voice gentler now, meant only for her. And not just casually. The room had gone completely silent. Emily was aware of every person watching, of the impossible situation unfolding. That was a long time ago, she said quietly. Grant turned to his investors. My challenge is this. I believe Emily can play this piano at a level that will astonish everyone in this room. If I'm wrong, I withdraw my proposal, Claire scoffed. You're basing a multi-million-dollar decision on whether your waitress can play the piano? I'm demonstrating my ability to recognize exceptional talent that others miss, Grant replied evenly. Isn't that exactly what you're investing in? Emily stood frozen, caught in a moment she never could have anticipated. The investors were watching with expressions ranging from amusement to irritation. Her job, her reputation, her carefully maintained professional boundary, all suddenly at risk. Mr. Grant, she began, her voice low. I don't think— One piece, he said, his eyes meeting hers with surprising intensity. That's all I'm asking. Emily looked at the piano, the instrument she had forced herself to walk past every day for 2 years without touching. The memory of her last recital flooded back, her father's proud smile in the audience, just weeks before the accident that had changed everything. I haven't played in 5 years, she whispered. But you can, Grant insisted, somehow certain. I'd bet everything on it. The gray-haired investor stood up. This is absurd, Alexander. We came here to discuss business, not to watch impromptu entertainment. Several others murmured agreement, reaching for their coats. The meeting was unraveling. Grant held up his hand. 2 minutes. Give me 2 minutes before you walk out that door. He turned back to Emily, his voice dropping so only she could hear. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I saw something in you. The way you carried yourself, how your hands moved to the music. Whatever happens, I'll make sure your job isn't affected. Emily looked from Grant to the increasingly impatient investors, then to Vivian, who had just entered the room, alarmed by the unusual situation. The moment stretched, a crossroads she hadn't seen coming. Then, taking a deep breath, Emily made her decision. Emily smoothed down her serving apron and looked at the piano. 5 years. 5 years since she had touched a piano key. The weight of everyone's stares pressed against her, but somehow it was the piano itself that seemed to be calling her. Okay, she said quietly. One piece. Vivian stepped forward, confusion evident on her face. Emily, what's happening here? It's fine, Vivian, Emily assured her manager, though her voice trembled slightly. Mr. Grant has made a request. Grant addressed the room. 2 minutes of your time, ladies and gentlemen. That's all I ask. The investors remained standing, coats half on, expressions ranging from annoyed to curious. Claire checked her watch pointedly. 2 minutes, she agreed coldly. Emily approached the piano, her heart pounding. She hadn't planned for this moment, hadn't prepared. For years, she had carefully locked away this part of herself, focusing only on survival, on tuition payments and rent checks, on moving forward without looking back. Her fingers hovered above the keys. The ivory felt cool and familiar as she sat on the bench, adjusting its height automatically, muscle memory taking over. For a moment, she was 12 again at her first recital, her teacher's voice echoing in her memory. Straight back. Relaxed shoulders, let your hands breathe. She closed her eyes, shutting out the room, the investors, even Grant. What should she play? Chopin had always been her favorite, but she hadn't practiced in so long. Would her fingers remember? Would they obey? There was only one way to find out. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the room, tentative at first, like someone testing thin ice. The familiar melody washed over her, and for a heartbeat she faltered, overwhelmed by how much she had missed this feeling. Then something shifted. Her fingers found their confidence muscle memory awakening from its long sleep. The notes began to flow more smoothly, the melody taking shape with increasing clarity. Behind her, she heard someone gasp softly. She didn't turn around. The music was carrying her now, sweeping her along like a current. Her left hand provided the steady rhythm while her right brought forth the haunting melody, each note ringing clear and true. In the kitchen doorway, the restaurant staff had begun to gather, drawn by the unexpected music. Chef Jean-Philippe stood with his arms crossed, spatula still in hand, listening with raised eyebrows. Nearby, diners paused their conversations, turning toward the sound. Emily felt herself sinking deeper into the piece, her body remembering what her conscious mind had tried to forget. The hours of practice, the competitions, the dreams. Before college tuition had become more important than music lessons. Before her father's medical bills had forced her to sell her piano. Before reality had replaced possibility. As the middle section of the Nocturne approached, more complex, more demanding, Emily braced herself, half expecting her unpracticed fingers to stumble. Instead, they danced across the keys with surprising agility, finding each note as if she had never stopped playing. The room had gone completely silent except for the music. Even the clinking of dishes from the main dining room seemed to have paused. In that moment, Emily wasn't aware of the investors watching with widening eyes, or Grant standing with a small, satisfied smile. She wasn't thinking about tips or tuition or tomorrow's shift. She was simply playing, existing within the music as she once had every day, before adult responsibilities had claimed her. When she reached the final section of the piece, she allowed herself to look up briefly. What she saw nearly made her lose her place in the music. Not only were Grant's investors watching in rapt attention, but guests from other parts of the restaurant had gathered at the doorway. Waitstaff stood frozen, trays in hand. Vivian's mouth was slightly open in shock, and Alexander Grant was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not triumph, as she might have expected, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. She returned her focus to the keys, bringing the piece to its gentle conclusion. The final notes hung in the air like a question. For several seconds afterward, no one moved or spoke. Then the applause began. It started with Grant, a slow, deliberate clapping that was quickly joined by others. The investors, the restaurant staff, the curious diners who had gathered to listen. The sound swelled until it filled the room. Emily sat frozen on the bench, her hands still resting on the keys. The moment felt surreal, like something from a dream. Slowly, she stood up, unsure what to do next. Should she bow? Return to serving dessert as if nothing had happened? Run from the room? Before she could decide, Claire stepped forward. The silver-haired investor who had been so skeptical earlier was looking at Emily with new interest. "Young lady," she said, her voice carrying across the now quiet room. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Emily smoothed her apron again, a nervous gesture. "Juilliard," she answered softly. "The pre-college program. I studied there from ages 8 to 18. A murmur ran through the crowd. Juilliard was a name that needed no explanation. One of the most prestigious performing arts schools in the world. "And now you're here," Claire said, her tone difficult to read. "Serving dinner." Grant stepped forward, inserting himself between them. "Life takes unexpected turns for all of us, doesn't it, Claire? The question is whether we can recognize value when we see it, even when it's not in the package we expected." He turned to the rest of his guests, who had completely forgotten about leaving. This is what I bring to the table, ladies and gentlemen. The ability to see potential others miss, to recognize exceptional talent hiding in plain sight. The gray-haired investor nodded slowly. Point made, Alexander. Very effectively, I might add, Grant smiled. But then his attention returned to Emily, who was standing awkwardly by the piano, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Thank you, Emily, he said. That was extraordinary. She nodded slightly, aware of all the eyes on her. May I? She gestured vaguely toward the service door. Of course, Grant replied. As Emily made her hasty retreat to the kitchen, she could hear the conversation behind her resuming with new energy. Grant's voice carried, confident once more, outlining his vision to investors who were suddenly much more receptive. In the kitchen, she leaned against the wall, her hands trembling slightly. Chef Jean-Philippe approached, looking at her with new eyes. 3 years, he said, shaking his head in wonder. 3 years you've worked here, and not once did you mention— It wasn't relevant, Emily replied, reaching for a glass of water. It's not part of my life anymore. Not relevant? Jean-Philippe repeated incredulously. My girl, you play like a concert pianist. I used to, she corrected him. Now I'm a server working my way through business school. Rick, the other server, poked his head into the kitchen. Emily, Mr. Grant is asking for you. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. The last thing she wanted was to return to that room, to face the curious stares, the questions. But she had a job to do, and regardless of what had just happened, she still needed this job. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her uniform and pushed through the door. The atmosphere in the private dining room had completely transformed. The investors were seated again, engaged in animated conversation. Several were checking things on their phones, nodding with interest. Grant stood apart from the group, waiting for her near the piano. I owe you an apology, he said when she approached. I put you on the spot. That wasn't fair. No, it wasn't, she agreed, finding unexpected courage in the aftermath of playing. But I understand why you did it. He studied her face. The Juilliard pre-college program is highly selective. You must have been exceptional. Emily looked away. That was a different life. What happened? Grant asked, his voice gentler than she had heard it before. For a moment, she considered deflecting the question, maintaining the professional boundary between server and customer. But something about having revealed this hidden part of herself made the usual barrier seem less important. My father got sick my senior year, she explained quietly. Cancer, the medical bills, and she trailed off, the story familiar and painful. I had scholarship offers, but we needed money, not more education expenses, so I started working instead. Grant nodded, understanding in his eyes. And business school now? Practical, she replied with a small shrug. A reliable future. He glanced back at the investors who were now reviewing documents with obvious interest. They're in. Your playing changed everything. He turned back to her. You changed everything. Emily didn't know how to respond to that. She straightened a fork on the nearby table, retreating to the safety of her job. Will your guests be wanting coffee? Grant looked as if he wanted to say more, but instead nodded. Yes, coffee would be good. Thank you. As Emily moved away to prepare the coffee service, she felt different somehow, as if playing those few minutes of Chopin had unlocked something she had carefully kept hidden, not just from others, but from herself. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Emily. She served coffee to Grant's investors, now animated and engaged in conversation about his proposal. Occasionally, she caught snippets. Phrases like bold vision and demonstrated intuition floated her way as she moved around the table. The skepticism from earlier had vanished, replaced by enthusiasm that seemed directly connected to her unexpected performance. As the investors finally prepared to leave, each one nodded to her with newfound respect. Claire, the silver-haired woman who had been so dismissive earlier, paused beside her. That was quite remarkable, she said quietly. Talent like yours is rare. Emily thanked her politely but felt a strange discomfort at the comment. Was it really her talent they were impressed by, or just the surprise of finding it in someone serving their dinner? After the private dining room emptied, Vivian pulled Emily aside in the kitchen. What just happened in there? Her manager asked, both confused and impressed. 1 minute you're serving dessert, the next you're giving a concert? It was just one piece, Emily replied, embarrassed by the attention. Mr. Grant somehow figured out I used to play and put me on the spot. Well, whatever happened, he left this for you. Vivian handed her an envelope. Inside was a tip that made Emily's eyes widen, enough to cover nearly a month's rent, and a business card with a handwritten note on the back. We should talk. Call me tomorrow. Alexander Grant. Emily slipped the card into her pocket, unsure what to make of it. The generous tip she understood. Rich people often threw money around when impressed. But the note suggested something else entirely. He also spoke with the owner, Vivian continued, watching Emily carefully. Asked if we could feature you playing piano during dinner service. What? Emily looked up, startled. I'm a server, not a performer. You could be both, according to Mr. Reynolds. He's thinking Thursdays and Saturdays to start. Said he'd pay you extra, of course. Emily shook her head, overwhelmed. I don't know, Vivian. I haven't seriously played in years. Well, think about it. You certainly had everyone's attention tonight. The next morning, Emily sat at her small kitchen table, staring at Grant's business card. The sensible thing would be to ignore it, to continue on her carefully planned path, finish her business degree, find a stable job, build the secure life she'd been working toward. But her fingers still tingled from the memory of the piano keys, a phantom sensation that had followed her into her dreams. She'd forgotten how it felt to lose herself in music, to express emotions that had no words. Before she could reconsider, she dialed the number. To her surprise, Grant answered himself. Alexander Grant. Mr. Grant, this is Emily Chen from Le Ciel. Emily. His voice warmed immediately. I was hoping you'd call. Are you free for lunch today? 3 hours later, Emily found herself at a small cafe near Central Park, sitting across from one of New York's most successful entrepreneurs. He'd arrived dressed casually in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, looking more like a college professor than a tech millionaire. Thank you for meeting me, Grant said after they'd ordered. I wanted to apologize properly for putting you in that position last night. But it worked out for you, Emily observed. Your investors seemed convinced. Grant nodded. They were, but that's not why I asked to see you. Then why did you? He leaned forward, his expression serious. Because I recognized something in your playing that went beyond technical skill. And I think you've been away from it for too long. Emily stirred her tea, uncomfortable with his directness. My life took a different path. Paths can change, Grant replied. I should know. I was pre-med before I switched to computer science. Their food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. Emily used the interruption to gather her thoughts. Mr. Grant, Alex, please. Alex, I appreciate your interest, but I'm not sure what you're suggesting. I have a job, classes, a plan. He nodded, taking a bite of his sandwich before responding. Fair enough. But tell me this, how did it feel to play again? The question hit her like a physical force. She looked down at her plate. Like coming home, she admitted quietly. Like finding something I didn't realize I'd lost. That's what I thought. He smiled, not triumphantly, but with genuine understanding. I felt the same way the first time I wrote code after 2 years of pre-med. Some talents aren't just skills, they're part of who we are. When they finished lunch, Alex walked with her through the park, their conversation shifting to his background, how he'd built his first company, the failures that had come before the successes. Emily found herself relaxing, surprised by how easy he was to talk to when not surrounded by business associates. Your restaurant manager called me this morning, he mentioned as they walked. Apparently word is spread about your playing. They've had several requests asking when the pianist Waitress will perform again, Emily groaned. Great, now I'm a gimmick. Or an opportunity. He stopped walking, turning to face her. Emily, I have a proposal for you. Hear me out before you answer. She raised an eyebrow but nodded for him to continue. I'd like you to play at an event I'm hosting next week, a charity fundraiser for music education in public schools. Many of the guests are potential donors to arts programs, people who could fund scholarships, instruments for schools' teaching positions. You want me to serve at your charity event? No, he said firmly. I want you to play as the featured performer. Emily stared at him. I couldn't possibly, it's been 5 years. And yet you played Chopin flawlessly with no preparation. He held up a hand as she began to protest. I know it wasn't perfect technically, but it was authentic and moving in a way that trained performers often miss. She shook her head, panic rising at the thought. A few minutes in a restaurant is one thing. A formal performance is completely different. I understand your hesitation, Alex said gently, but sometimes the universe gives us second chances in unexpected ways. This could be yours. The following Thursday night found Emily back at Le Ciel, but in a completely different role. The owner had made good on his offer, rearranging the main dining room to feature the piano prominently. Emily had agreed to play one night a week, an experiment, she told herself. Nothing more. She arrived an hour before her usual shift, dressed in her server's uniform with a simple black cardigan instead of the usual waistcoat. Vivian had suggested she could wear something different for playing, but Emily insisted on keeping some sense of normalcy. Ready? Vivian asked as the first dinner guests began to arrive. Not remotely, Emily replied honestly. You'll be wonderful. Vivian squeezed her shoulder. And if it's terrible, we'll pretend it never happened and you can go back to dropping plates like the rest of us. Emily smiled gratefully at the attempt at humor. At 8 o'clock, she took her place at the piano. The restaurant wasn't full yet, which was a small mercy. She placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. She started with Eric Satie's Gymnopédies, gentle, flowing pieces that allowed her to settle her nerves. As the notes filled the room, she felt the initial terror begin to fade, replaced by the familiar comfort of the music. After the Satie, she moved to Debussy, then back to her beloved Chopin. With each piece, her confidence grew. She became less aware of the diners watching her and more immersed in the music itself. By 9:30, the restaurant was completely full. What Emily didn't know was that the owner had spread the word about the Juilliard-trained pianist now performing during dinner service. People who had merely come for the food found themselves lingering over dessert, reluctant to leave while she was playing. When she finally took a short break, she was surprised to find several people waiting to speak with her. An older couple asked if she took private students. A young man wanted to know if she had recordings available. A woman who introduced herself as the artistic director of a small community music school handed her a business card. Overwhelmed, Emily retreated to the kitchen for a glass of water. "There's someone else asking for you," Rick told her, nodding toward the dining room. Table 12. Emily peeked out and was surprised to see Alex Grant sitting alone at a corner table, watching her with a thoughtful expression. When their eyes met, he raised his glass in a silent toast. She made her way to his table, suddenly self-conscious. "I didn't know you were coming tonight. I wanted to hear you play again," he replied simply, without the pressure of skeptical investors. "And?" A slow smile spread across his face. "Even better than I remembered. You're a natural performer, Emily. The entire room feels what you're playing." She shook her head, still not used to compliments about her music. "I'm just knocking off the rust. I noticed you added some of your own compositions to the set." Emily looked at him in surprise. "You recognize that?" "The piece after the Debussy. It wasn't any classical composition, I know, and I grew up with a concert pianist mother." He studied her with new interest. "You're a composer as well." She felt herself blushing. "Just something I was working on before I stopped playing." "It was beautiful," he said quietly. "Haunting, actually." "Does it have a title?" "Unfinished," she replied with a small smile. "Seemed appropriate," Alex laughed. "Well, maybe now you can finish it." As Emily returned to the piano for her second set, something had shifted inside her. The restaurant, the audience, even her own doubts seemed to fade away as she placed her hands on the keys. This time she began with her own composition, the unfinished piece she'd mentioned to Alex, but as she played, new notes came to her, the melody expanding and developing in ways she hadn't planned. People at nearby tables paused their conversations. A woman at the bar took out her phone and began recording. In the kitchen doorway, Chef Jean-Philippe stood listening, a rare smile on his usually stern face. And at his corner table, Alexander Grant watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing he'd been right all along. 1 week later, Emily stood backstage at the Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. After much persuasion from Alex, she had agreed to perform at his charity fundraiser for music education. Now wearing a borrowed evening gown and fighting waves of panic, she was seriously questioning that decision. 5 minutes, a stagehand informed her, checking something off on his clipboard before hurrying away. Emily peeked through the curtain at the crowd gathered in the ballroom. At least 300 people in formal attire, representing some of the wealthiest art patrons and philanthropists in the city. Tables adorned with elaborate centerpieces surrounded a small open area near the stage where a gleaming grand piano waited. Her hands trembled as she let the curtain fall back into place. What had she been thinking? 5 years without serious practice, and now she was supposed to perform for people who regularly attended Carnegie Hall? People who could distinguish between a merely competent pianist and a truly gifted one. Nervous? Alex's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking every bit the successful entrepreneur and host. Terrified would be more accurate, she admitted. I don't belong here, Alex. These people, he interrupted gently, are about to discover what I already know. That music isn't just something you do. It's who you are. Before she could respond, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly and the MC began introducing Alex to the stage. He gave her arm a reassuring squeeze before stepping through the curtain to enthusiastic applause. Emily listened as Alex welcomed everyone and spoke passionately about the importance of music education in public schools. He shared statistics about how access to music programs improved academic performance and graduation rates, particularly in underserved communities. Many of us here tonight were fortunate enough to have music in our lives from an early age. His voice carried clearly to where she stood. We had parents who could afford lessons, schools with well-funded arts programs, opportunities to develop our talents. But what about the children who don't have those advantages? The crowd murmured in agreement. Tonight's proceeds will help provide instruments, instruction, and opportunities for students who might otherwise never discover their musical gifts, Alex continued. And to demonstrate just how transformative music can be, I've invited a very special performer to play for us. Emily's stomach clenched. This was it. This young woman began studying piano at age 6, Alex was saying. By 12, she was enrolled in Juilliard's pre-college program. Her professors predicted a brilliant concert career. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The audience was completely silent now, attentive to his words. Financial hardship forced her to set aside her musical dreams. For 5 years, she didn't touch a piano. Instead, she worked multiple jobs to support herself and her family, her exceptional talent hidden away. I discovered her not in a concert hall, but serving dinner at a restaurant where I often meet clients. Emily closed her eyes, embarrassed by how personal the introduction had become. When I first heard her play, after challenging her to demonstrate her forgotten skills, the room fell silent in awe. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce her to you not as a server, but as the remarkable pianist she was always meant to be. Please welcome Emily Chen. The spotlight found her as she walked onto the stage, her borrowed heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The audience applauded politely, curious but reserved. Many were probably wondering why a waitress was the featured performer at such a prestigious event. Emily sat at the piano, adjusting the bench automatically. She looked out at the sea of expectant faces, then found Alex standing off to the side, nodding encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, she placed her hands on the keys. She had decided to begin with Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a challenging piece that had once been her signature performance. As the opening notes filled the ballroom, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the pressure of 300 critical listeners weighing on her. The first minute was mechanical, her fingers finding the right notes but her heart not yet in the music. Then gradually something shifted. As the piece progressed from its gentle beginning to its more dramatic middle section, Emily felt the tension in her body begin to dissolve. The music took over, flowing through her as it once had years ago. She forgot about the audience, forgot about her doubts, forgot about everything except the conversation her hands were having with the piano, the story they were telling together. When she reached the piece's powerful conclusion, the final chord seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat before the room erupted in applause. Emily looked up, startled by the enthusiastic response. Several people had risen to their feet. Encouraged, she moved to her second piece, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. Her fingers flew across the keys with growing confidence, the technically demanding passages coming more easily than she had expected. The muscle memory that had lain dormant for 5 years was awakening fully now. guided by something deeper than practice, by the music that had always been part of her. For her final scheduled piece, she had chosen Debussy's Clair de Lune, its dreamlike quality a contrast to the intensity of the Rachmaninoff. As the last delicate notes faded away, the entire audience rose in a standing ovation. Emily stood and bowed, breathless and slightly dazed. The applause continued, showing no signs of stopping. After a second bow, she realized they were expecting an encore. She sat again, hesitating only briefly before beginning to play her own composition, the one she had been working on before life had interrupted her musical journey. In the week since she'd played it at the restaurant, she had continued developing it, the creative spark reignited. The piece was still untitled, still evolving, but it was undeniably hers. The room grew silent once more as the unfamiliar melody filled the space. Emily poured everything into it, her lost years, her rediscovered passion, her uncertain future. When she finished, the applause was different, not just appreciative but moved, as if the audience had shared in something deeply personal. At the reception afterward, Emily found herself surrounded by people eager to speak with her. A gray-haired woman who introduced herself as the director of the city's community music school offered her a teaching position. A man with a distinguished beard handed her his card. He ran a small recording studio and was interested in her original compositions. Most surprising was the elegant, older woman who approached with Alex at her side. Emily, this is Dr. Elaine Powell. Alex introduced them. She's the chair of continuing education at Juilliard. Your performance was remarkable, Dr. Powell said, studying Emily with keen interest. Alexander tells me you left the program before completing your studies. Emily nodded, suddenly feeling like the shy 12-year-old who had first auditioned for the school. Family circumstances, she explained simply. Well, we should discuss how you might resume your education, Dr. Powell said. We have fellowship programs specifically designed for returning students with exceptional talent. As Dr. Powell moved away to speak with another guest, Emily turned to Alex in disbelief. Did that just happen? He smiled. I told you these people would recognize what I saw in you. You set this up, she accused him, though there was no anger in her voice. I made some calls, he admitted. But your playing did the rest. You were extraordinary tonight, Emily. Later, as the event wound down and the last guest departed, Emily found herself alone with Alex on the empty stage, the piano still open behind them. Thank you, she said quietly. Not just for tonight, but for... She gestured vaguely, struggling to put it into words. For putting you on the spot at the restaurant. He suggested with a grin. She laughed. Yes, actually. As terrifying as that was, it changed everything. You did that yourself, Alex said seriously. I just created the opportunity. You had the courage to take it. Emily looked at the piano, then back at him. I still don't understand why you did it. Why me? Alex was quiet for a moment. My mother was a concert pianist, he said finally. Brilliant by all accounts. But she gave it up when she married my father because he thought a proper wife shouldn't have a career. By the time I was old enough to understand what she'd sacrificed, it was too late. She'd convinced herself she was happy with her choice. Emily listened, beginning to understand. When I heard you play that first night, he continued, I saw the same buried talent, the same loss. But in your case, it wasn't too late. And the investors? Was that just an excuse? He smiled ruefully. The investors were real enough, but I would have found another way to convince them. Hearing you play that night, it felt like a second chance, not just for you, but for every musician who had to set aside their gifts. Emily nodded, thinking of the charity they'd raised money for tonight, of all the children who might now have opportunities she hadn't. So what happens now? Alex asked. Will you go back to Juilliard? Take the teaching position, both? Emily looked out at the empty ballroom, considering the question. A month ago, her path had seemed so clear. Finish her business degree, find a stable job, build a predictable life. Now everything had changed. I don't know yet, she answered honestly. But for the first time in 5 years, I'm excited to find out. 6 months later, the headline in the art section of the city paper read, From Waitress to Headliner, Emily Chen's Remarkable Journey. The accompanying photo showed Emily at a piano on the stage of a small but prestigious concert hall, her first professional recital already sold out. In the front row, Alexander Grant sat beside Emily's father, now in remission and beaming with pride.